I'm Alara Thorne, I'm 38 years old, and yesterday I sat across from the man who told me I'd be lucky to wait tables for the rest of my life, and I watched him beg me for a job. The executive suite was silent, save for the rhythmic, expensive ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The room smelled of rain-dampened wool and the faint, sharp sting of bleach from the morning cleaning crew. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city was a blur of charcoal grays and navy blues, the skyscrapers disappearing into a thick, low-hanging mist. I sat perfectly still in my tailored cream blazer, the silk lining cool against my shoulders. My hair was pulled back into a knot so tight it felt like a crown. Across from me sat Arthur Sterling. He was 70 now, and the years had not been kind. The man who once loomed over me like a titan of industry was now a frail figure in a suit that hung off his bony frame. His hands, spotted with age, trembled as he adjusted his spectacles. He didn't recognize me. To him I was Miss Thorne, the powerhouse COO of Thorne Acquisitions, the woman who had just bought out the entire school district's private pension fund. He cleared his throat, the sound dry and brittle. "I appreciate you seeing me on such short notice, Miss Thorne," he said, his voice whistling through his teeth. "I have spent 40 years molding minds. I have a reputation for discipline. I believe I could be an asset to your firm's educational outreach program. I know how to spot the winners, and more importantly, I know how to discard the dead weight." I leaned back, the leather of my chair creaking softly. "Discard the dead weight," I repeated. My voice was like velvet over gravel, calm, low, and dangerous. "That's a very clinical way to talk about children, Arthur." He gave a thin, condescending smile, the same one he used to wear in the hallways of Lincoln High. "It's a mercy. Really, some girls are born for the ballroom, and some are born for the basement. I remember one, Alara, her name was, a messy, quiet thing, always daydreaming. I told her to her face she'd be lucky to scrub floors by 30. You have to be realistic with them, Miss Thorne. It prevents them from having delusions of grandeur." A cold, familiar fire flickered in my chest. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't call him a monster. I simply reached into my mahogany desk and pulled out a small laminated slip of paper. It was a detention slip from 2004. The ink faded, but the handwriting unmistakable. I placed it face down on the table, my manicured nail tapping the surface with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. "Realism is a double-edged sword, Arthur," I said, my eyes locking onto his, "and sometimes the basement turns out to be a foundation for a skyscraper." Before I tell you what was written on that yellow detention slip, and how Arthur Sterling's face turned the color of ash when he realized the dead weight was now his boss, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it there. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The year was 2004. Lincoln High was a fortress of red brick and broken dreams. I remember the weight of my backpack. It was always too heavy, filled with textbooks I'd bought second-hand, their spines held together by silver duct tape. I was the girl who sat in the shadow of the radiator trying to absorb its heat because my mother and I were living in a studio apartment where the windows didn't quite shut. I wasn't a cool girl. I was the girl with the frizzy hair and the oversized sweaters, the one who smelled faintly of the cheap laundry detergent we used at the communal laundromat. My mother worked 3 jobs, cleaning houses, waitressing, and sewing repairs. At night, I would sit at our tiny kitchen table, helping her thread needles until my eyes burned under the flickering fluorescent light. By the time I walked into Mr. T. Sterling's advanced history seminar at 7:30 a.m., I was already exhausted. The world felt like it was moving in slow motion, a gray blur of facts and figures that didn't seem to matter when you were worried about the rent check bouncing. Mr. Sterling was the undisputed ruler of the social studies department. He didn't just teach history, he judged it. He loved the pedigree students, the ones whose mothers wore pearls to PTA meetings. He looked at me like I was a smudge on a clean window. I remember a Tuesday in November. A biting sleet was tapping against the classroom glass, a frantic, nervous sound. I had spent the night before nursing my mother through a fever, and I had fallen asleep for exactly 20 minutes over my final essay on the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly, a heavy textbook slammed onto my desk. The sound was like a gunshot. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. The class erupted in snickers. Mr. Sterling was standing over me, his face twisted into a mask of pure intellectual arrogance. "Ms. Thorne," he said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "I realize that the struggles of the working class in the 19th century might be too relatable for you, but do try to remain conscious. Or is the sheer effort of being mediocre taking its toll? I'm sorry, sir, I stammered, trying to tuck a stray, frizzy lock of hair behind my ear. I was helping my mother. She's sick. A predictable excuse for a predictable girl, he sneered. He picked up my essay with the tips of his fingers as if it were contaminated. He walked to the front of the room and held it up. Look at this, class. The margins are uneven. The ink is smudged. It looks like it was written in a gutter. Elara, you are a ghost. You drift through these halls thinking you will eventually land somewhere. But let me be clear, people like you don't land. You fall. You'll be lucky if you're cleaning the toilets in a building like this in 20 years. He took a thick red marker and drew a jagged F across the cover page. He pressed so hard the tip of the marker squeaked against the paper, a sound that set my teeth on edge. Now, he said, tossing the paper back at me so it fluttered to the floor. Pick that up. It's the only thing you'll ever truly own. I knelt down to pick up the paper, the cold tile pressing against my knees. I felt the heat of humiliation crawling up my neck, but I didn't let a single tear fall. I looked at the red F. It didn't look like a failure to me. It looked like a target. As I walked out of the classroom that day, I heard Mr. Sterling laughing with the principal in the hallway. He said something about my mother's reputation in town, a lie so sharp it felt like a knife between my ribs. It was a secret he thought was buried, but it was the very thing that would eventually lead me back to him. The memory of that red pen haunts me more than the words Mr. Sterling actually spoke. It wasn't just a tool for grading. In his hand, it was a weapon. I remembered the way the plastic barrel caught the light of the buzzing overhead fluorescence, and the aggressive, rhythmic click-clack as he prepared to dismantle a student's confidence. It was 2 weeks after the F-grade incident. The classroom was stifling. The radiator in the corner was hissing like a cornered animal, emitting a dry metallic heat that made everyone's head heavy. I was sitting at my usual desk, the wood scarred with the initials of students who had long since escaped this town. I was staring at a blank page, my hand trembling slightly. Mr. Sterling was pacing the front of the room. He didn't just walk, he marched, his polished Oxfords clicking against the linoleum tiles with a precision that felt predatory. He was returning our midterm essays. Writing, he began, his voice dropping to that low, performative tone he used when he wanted to sound profound, is a reflection of the soul. If your thoughts are cluttered, your prose is cluttered. If your life is a mess, well, your paper will reflect that. He stopped at the desk of Marcus Vane, the son of the local judge. Marcus had a brand new leather satchel and a smile that said he'd never known a day of hunger. Sterling placed a paper on his desk with a gentle, approving nod. Gold star, Marcus. Excellent grasp of the nuances of the Great Depression. It's clear you understand what it means to manage resources. Then he turned his gaze toward me. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I felt the girl next to me, Chloe, shift her chair away, as if my failure might be contagious. Sterling didn't walk to my desk. He stood in the center of the aisle and held my paper up high, as if he were displaying a piece of evidence in a crime scene. And then, he sighed, the sound heavy with fake disappointment. We have Elara, or should I say, the mystery of the missing effort. He walked toward me, each step echoing. When he reached my desk, he didn't put the paper down. He hovered it just out of my reach. I could see the front page. It wasn't just an F this time. He had used that red pen to circle every single smudge, every slightly crooked line of my handwriting. It looked like the paper had been caught in a barbed wire fence. I asked for a thesis on the economic collapse of 1929, he whispered, leaning down so only I, and the 3 rows around me, could hear. Instead, you gave me a sob story written in the dark. Tell me, Elara, do you even own a lamp? Or does the electricity bill get in the way of your creative process? A few boys in the back snickered. I looked down at my hands. They were stained with a bit of grease from the gears of the laundry press I'd been helping my mother fix until 2 a.m. I tried to hide them under the desk. My mother is working hard, sir, I said, my voice barely a thread. I do my best with what I have. Your best is a poverty of the mind, Elara, he snapped, dropping the paper. It fluttered and landed in a puddle of melted slush that had dripped off someone's boots. The red ink began to bleed into the dirty water, turning a pale, sickly pink. You think the world cares about your struggle. The world only cares about results. And you? You are a zero. You come from nothing, you provide nothing, and you will become nothing. You are simply a space filler until someone more qualified takes your seat. He leaned in even closer then. The smell of his peppermint tea was suffocating. "I saw your mother yesterday," he whispered, his eyes glinting with a cruel secret, "cleaning the floors at the country club. She looked pathetic. She looked pathetic. Is that the future you're aiming for? Or are the rumors about how she really pays the rent true?" The room went white. My ears began to ring. It wasn't just about my grades anymore. He was attacking the only person who loved me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and throw the heavy history book at his perfectly straight teeth, but I didn't. I sat there, frozen. I felt a tear track down my cheek, hot and stinging, but I didn't wipe it away. I watched the red ink from his pen dissolve in the puddle on the floor. In that moment, something inside me didn't break. It hardened. It turned into a cold, black stone. I realized then that Mr. Sterling didn't want me to learn. He wanted me to disappear. He wanted to use his red pen to erase me from the story of this town. I reached down and picked up the wet, ruined paper. The F was blurred now, but the indentation of the pen was still there, carved into the fiber of the page. I looked him dead in the eye, the first time I had ever dared to do so. "I'll remember this, Mr. Sterling," I said. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. He laughed. A short, bark-like sound. "I certainly hope so. Perhaps it will serve as a warning when you are applying for a job at the car wash." He turned his back on me, returning to his chalkboard to write out the next lesson. But as he wrote, his red pen ran out of ink. He shook it, cursed under his breath, and tossed it into the trash can near my desk. I waited until the end of the period. When the bell rang and the room emptied, I didn't leave. I stood up, reached into the bin, and pulled out that empty red pen. 20 years later, that same pen sits in a velvet-lined case in my office. And today, I'm going to use it one last time. But as I left the classroom that day in 2004, I didn't realize that Mr. Sterling had already made a phone call that would change my mother's life forever, and not in the way I expected. The walk home from school that day felt longer than usual. The sleet had turned into a heavy, wet snow that clung to the eyelashes and turned the sidewalk into a treacherous mirror of gray slush. Every step I took felt like I was dragging the weight of Mr. Sterling's words behind me, a heavy chain of nothingness and failure. Our apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better days, decades ago. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and the damp, earthy scent of rotting wood. I reached our door, number 3B, and paused. Usually I could hear the rhythmic thump whir of the sewing machine, or the sound of the radio playing old jazz, the only luxury my mother allowed herself. But today, it was silent. I pushed the door open. The air inside was freezing. We had a broken compass of a heater. It pointed toward warmth, but never actually delivered it. My mother was sitting at the small laminate kitchen table. She wasn't sewing. She wasn't cooking. She was just sitting there, her hands folded over a piece of official-looking stationery. The light from the single bulb overhead cast long, tired shadows across her face. She looked older than 40, her skin was the color of parchment, and the fine lines around her eyes seemed deeper, like cracks in a dry riverbed. "Mom," I whispered, dropping my bag by the door. "What happened? Is your fever back?" She didn't look up at first. She just pushed the letter toward me. Her voice was a ghost of itself. Mr. Sterling called the country club Elara. And then he called the district social services. I felt a coldness in my stomach that had nothing to do with the winter air. I picked up the letter. It was a formal notice from the housing authority. Because of anonymous reports regarding the unsuitability of our living conditions and my mother's inability to provide a stable environment for a minor, we were being flagged for a mandatory home inspection. In this town, an inspection for people like us usually meant one thing: eviction. He told them I was unfit, she said, a single tear escaping and tracking through the dusting of flour on her cheek. He told the manager at the club that I was stealing cleaning supplies to sell. "They let me go, Elara. Without my reference, I can't get another shift at the hotel." I felt the red pen in my pocket. It felt like a hot coal against my leg. He hadn't just humiliated me in class. He was trying to erase our very existence. He wanted to prove his prophecy, right by manufacturing our downfall. If we lost the apartment, if she lost her jobs, I would end up exactly where he said, a ghost in a doorway. "I'm sorry, Mom," I choked out, kneeling beside her. "It's because of me, because I fell asleep in his class, because I'm not good enough." She finally looked at me, and for a moment, the exhaustion vanished. replaced by a flicker of that iron-willed woman who had raised me alone. She took my face in her rough, calloused hands. "Listen to me, Elara," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "That man, he looks at a seed and only sees the dirt covering it. He doesn't see the life inside. You are not your grades. You are not this apartment, and you are certainly not what a bitter man says about you to feel powerful." We spent that night not in tears, but in a quiet, desperate sort of labor. We knew the inspector would come within 48 hours. We spent the night scrubbing. We used the last of the dish soap to wash the walls. We stuffed old newspapers into the cracks of the window frames to keep the draft out. I used my history textbook, the one Sterling loved so much, to prop up the leg of the kitchen table so it wouldn't wobble when the inspector sat down. As I worked, my mind began to drift. I looked at the broken compass my father had left behind, a small brass trinket that never pointed north. It just spun in circles, lost. I realized I was like that compass. I was spinning, reacting to Sterling's cruelty, reacting to the school's pressure, reacting to our poverty. Stop spinning, I told myself. Find a direction. If Mr. Sterling wanted to play a game of realism, I would give it to him, but I wouldn't play by his rules. I wouldn't try to win his approval anymore. I would win his life. I would become the person who decided who was realistic and who wasn't. That night, lying on the thin mattress with the sound of the wind howling outside, I didn't think about the French Revolution. I thought about the way the school district's budget was structured. I thought about the property developers who were buying up the town. I thought about the quiet, invisible threads of power that held a place like this together. I fell asleep dreaming of a boardroom, not a classroom, but a room where the walls were made of glass, and no one could ever tell me I was nothing again. The next morning the inspector arrived. He was a portly man with a clipboard and a bored expression. He looked at our scrubbed floors and our taped windows. He looked at my mother, who stood with her back straight, wearing her best, an only white blouse. He took out a pen, a blue one, thank God, and made a mark on his paper. The report was exaggerated. The man muttered, looking almost disappointed. "Conditions are meager, but not hazardous. You're cleared for now." As he left, I saw a black car idling at the curb. Mr. Sterling was in the driver's seat, watching. When he saw the inspector leave without a condemned sign, his grip on the steering wheel tightened. He looked at me through the windshield, his face a mask of cold, academic fury. He didn't know it yet, but he had just given me the greatest gift of my life. He had shown me his hand. He had shown me that he wasn't just a teacher. He was a coward who used his position to bully those who couldn't fight back. And I was learning how to fight. But as I walked back into the apartment, I found my mother staring at the broken compass on the table. It had finally stopped spinning. It was pointing directly at the door. "Elara," she said softly, "there's someone here to see you. They say they're from the university. But I didn't apply for anything. Did you?" The university visitor had turned out to be a scout for a regional merit program, but in our town, hope was often just another word for a longer fall. While that meeting planted a seed, it was the annual Lincoln High Science and Innovation Fair that became the site of my public execution and my ultimate rebirth. The gymnasium smelled of floor wax, sawdust, and the ozone-heavy scent of dozens of electronic projects humming at once. It was February. The windows high up in the rafters were frosted over, trapping us in a cavern of bright lights and nervous energy. I stood at booth 42, tucked in the back corner near the emergency exit. My project wasn't flashy. I didn't have the volcanic eruptions of baking soda or the expensive pre-built robotics kits the wealthy kids had. I had built a water filtration prototype using charcoal, sand, and a series of recycled containers. It was a response to the murky water that often came out of the taps in our part of town, a practical solution for a real problem. I had spent months testing it, using a discarded chemistry set I'd found at a garage sale. I had titled it The Clarity Project. My mother had stayed up with me the night before, helping me hand-letter the display board. We couldn't afford the vinyl lettering Marcus Vane used, so we used a black marker and a steady hand. I wore my one good blouse, the collar starched so stiff it scratched my neck, and I stood tall. For the first time, I felt like I had something he couldn't take away. Data. The judging panel moved through the aisles like a slow-moving storm front, and of course, leading the group as the administrative liaison was Mr. Sterling. He looked immaculate in a tweed blazer, a silk pocket square tucked perfectly into his breast pocket. He held a clipboard, the same kind the housing inspector had used, and a red pen tucked behind his ear. When they reached my booth, the air seemed to vanish. The two other judges, a local engineer and a soft-spoken librarian, looked at my charts with genuine interest. So Alara, the engineer said, leaning in, you're claiming this gravity-fed system can remove 98% of particulate matter from standard tap water? Yes, sir, I said, my voice clear. I had practiced this. It's designed for high-density housing with aging infrastructure. It costs less than $5 to maintain. The engineer nodded, impressed. Simple, elegant, scalable. Elegant, scalable. He was about to write something on his scorecard when Sterling stepped forward. He didn't look at the project. He looked at me. He looked at the slightly frayed edge of my display board and the recycled plastic of my filters. Scalable. Sterling laughed, a dry, mocking sound that echoed against the gym walls. Let's be honest here. It's a series of buckets filled with dirt. It's exactly the kind of primitive thinking I've come to expect from you, Miss Thorne. The librarian frowned. Arthur, the filtration rates are quite remarkable. The rates are irrelevant if the methodology is flawed, Sterling interrupted, his voice rising so the neighboring booths would hear. He pulled the red pen from behind his ear. Look at the aesthetics. Look at the lack of professional-grade materials. This isn't innovation. This is a cry for help. It's a craft project from someone who clearly doesn't have the resources to compete at this level. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over my display. You see, Alara, the problem with the Clarity Project is that it lacks clarity about your own station in life. You're trying to solve infrastructure problems when you can't even afford a proper presentation board. He didn't just mark his scorecard. He reached out and, with a slow, deliberate motion, used the red pen to draw a large X across my main data chart, the one my mother and I had spent 6 hours perfecting. Disqualified for lack of professional rigor, he announced. The silence that followed was deafening. The engineer looked uncomfortable, the librarian looked horrified, but no one challenged him. Sterling was the gatekeeper. He turned his back on me and moved to Marcus Vane's booth, where a $2,000 pre-assembled wind turbine was spinning under a high-powered fan. Now this, I heard Sterling say, his voice dripping with warmth. This is what a future looks like. I stood there, staring at the red X. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, the familiar sting of tears. I looked at my hands. They were shaking. I wanted to tear the whole booth down. I wanted to run out into the snow and never come back. But then, I looked at the X again. It wasn't just a mark of failure, it was a signature. He had signed his name to my resolve. I didn't cry. Instead, I reached into my pocket and felt the empty red pen I had stolen from his trash can weeks ago. I squeezed it until the plastic bit into my palm. Thank you, Arthur, I thought. You just gave me the fuel I need to burn this whole town down and build something better. As the awards ceremony began and Marcus Bain was handed a plastic gold trophy, I quietly packed up my buckets of dirt. I didn't stay for the applause. I walked out the back exit into the freezing night. But as I reached the edge of the school parking lot, a car pulled up beside me. It was the engineer from the judging panel. He rolled down his window, the heater from his car puffing out in white clouds. Miss Thorne, he said, handing me a business card. Don't let that man break you. The filtration worked. I tested a sample when he wasn't looking. Call me when you graduate. There's a world outside this zip code that doesn't care about aesthetic rigor. I took the card. It was for a major environmental firm in the city. I looked back at the gym, the lights glowing like a dying star. Mr. Sterling thought he had ended my career before it began. He didn't realize he had just introduced me to my first business partner. But there was one thing the engineer didn't know. A secret Sterling had hidden in the school's archives that would nearly cost me my graduation. The final months of high school felt like a long, slow walk through an active minefield. After the science fair, I became a ghost. I didn't participate in class. I didn't volunteer. I simply sat, watched, and recorded. I kept a small notebook, not for history notes, but for observations. I watched how Mr. Sterling favored certain students, how he manipulated the school board's perception, and how he used his red pen to systematically prune anyone he deemed unworthy of the Lincoln High legacy. But the real blow came 3 weeks before graduation. I was called into the administrative office. The room was heavy with the scent of old paper and the clacking of a typewriter from the front desk. Mr. Sterling was there, sitting behind the principal's desk, as if he already owned it. He didn't ask me to sit. There's a discrepancy, Alara, he said, his voice smooth and devoid of any warmth. He tapped a manila folder. In your community service hours, It seems the hours you claimed for helping at the local clinic haven't been properly verified. Without those credits, you don't meet the requirements for graduation. You'll be 3 credits short. I felt the blood drain from my face. I had worked those hours every Saturday for 2 years. I had the signatures. I turned in the log sheets months ago, sir, to you. He smiled, a slow, thin horizontal line. Did you? I don't recall, and since they aren't in the file, well, as I told you before, the world only cares about results, not intentions. You won't be walking across that stage with your class. He was trying to take the one thing I had worked for, my exit ticket. Without a diploma, the engineer's card in my pocket was just a piece of paper. He wanted to trap me here, in this town, in the basement he had prophesied for me. I didn't argue, I didn't beg. I simply turned and walked out. I spent the next 48 hours in the school's basement archives, a dusty, forgotten labyrinth where I worked as a student aide. I wasn't looking for my logs. I knew he had destroyed those. I was looking for his logs. I found them. A stack of mismanaged fund reports and donations from parents like Marcus Vane's father that had been diverted into special administrative projects. I didn't take the originals. I just took photos. And then, I found my log sheets, shoved into a recycling bin behind his desk, torn in half but still legible. I didn't go to the principal. I didn't go to the police. I went to Mr. Sterling's office on the morning of graduation. He was putting on his academic robes, looking at himself in a small mirror. When he saw me in the reflection, he didn't even turn around. I thought I told you there would be no graduation for you, Alara. I placed a small envelope on his desk. Inside were the photos of the diverted funds and the taped-together remains of my community service logs. I'm not here to negotiate, Arthur, I said. My voice was calm, scary calm. I'm here to tell you that I'm walking today, and you're going to be the one to hand me my diploma. And you're going to smile while you do it. He opened the envelope. His face went from arrogant to pale to a sickly shade of gray. He looked at the photos, then at me. For the first time in 4 years, the power dynamic shifted. The air in the room didn't belong to him anymore. This is blackmail, he hissed. No, I replied softly. This is clarity. Isn't that what you called my project? A lack of professional rigor? It seems you have the same problem. 2 hours later, I stood in the line of students, draped in a cheap polyester gown that felt like a suit of armor. The sun was beating down on the football field, the air thick with the smell of freshly cut grass and the sound of a brass band playing a slightly out-of-tune march. When my name was called, Alara Thorne, the silence from the faculty row was palpable. I walked across the stage. Mr. Raskrotz, Mr. Sterling stood there, his hands trembling as he held the leather-bound diploma. As I reached for it, he leaned in. His breath smelled of sour peppermint. You think you've won, don't you? You think a piece of paper changes who you are. Listen to me, Alara. This is the peak of your life. From here it's a long, slow slide into the gutter. You'll be a janitor at best, a failure at worst. I'll see to it that no university in this state takes you. It was his final prophecy, a curse whispered under the cover of a graduation ceremony. I took the diploma, gripped his hand firmly, and leaned in close to his ear. The cameras flashed, capturing what looked like a proud teacher congratulating a student. Don't worry, Arthur, I whispered. I'm not going to a university in this state. I'm going to build a world where people like you are obsolete. And in 20 years, I'm coming back for your chair. I walked off that stage without looking back. I didn't join the other kids in throwing their caps. I walked straight to my mother, who was standing by the fence in her faded white blouse, her eyes wet with tears. We're leaving tonight, Mom, I said. Where to? She asked. Wherever the red pen can't reach us, I replied. But as we drove out of the town limits in our battered old car, I saw Mr. Sterling standing in the rearview mirror, watching us go. He was smiling. It was a smile that told me he had one last card to play. A secret about my father that he had kept hidden in those archives. A secret that would haunt my climb to the top for the next 2 decades. The city was a jagged landscape of concrete and glass, a far cry from the red brick suffocations of Lincoln High. For the first 5 years after leaving, I lived in the long silence. It was a period defined not by words, but by the rhythmic, mechanical sounds of survival, the hiss of industrial steamers, the clatter of subway trains at 3 a.m., and the scratching of my pen against a notebook in a windowless studio apartment. I worked 3 jobs. By day, I was a junior clerk at the environmental firm the engineer had recommended. By evening, I waited tables at a high-end bistro, where the tips were good but the humiliation was constant. At night, I did data entry for a logistics company. I was a ghost in the machinery of the city, invisible to the wealthy patrons who barked orders at me, just as I had been invisible to Mr. Sterling. But there was a difference now. Every insult I endured at the bistro was a deposit into a mental bank. Every hour of data entry was a lesson in how the world's money actually moved. I wasn't just working, I was observing the infrastructure of power. I lived in a space so small that if I extended my arms, I could almost touch both walls. It smelled of cheap coffee and the damp wool of my only professional coat. On the wall I had taped that ruined science fair chart, the one with Sterling's red X slashed across it. It was my North Star. One rainy Tuesday, 3 years into my silence, I found the first piece of the puzzle Sterling had hinted at. I had been using my meager savings to hire a private researcher, not for my future, but for my past. I needed to know what he meant about my father. The researcher met me in a dimly lit diner where the air was thick with the smell of burnt grease. He slid a folder across the cracked Formica table. "Your father didn't just walk out, Alara," a man said, his voice low. He was a whistleblower at the local textile mill 20 years ago. He found out they were dumping chemicals into the town's groundwater. The school board at the time, and a certain administrative liaison named Arthur Sterling, were heavily invested in that mill. Your father was silenced, not with a bribe, but with a threat. They framed him for embezzlement and ran him out of town to protect their portfolios. I felt a coldness settle in my marrow that no heater could ever touch. My father wasn't a failure who abandoned us. He was a man who had been crushed by the same red pen that had tried to crush me. Sterling hadn't just bullied a student. He had dismantled a family to protect a profit margin. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply thanked the man, took the folder, and walked back into the rain. The long silence was over. It was time for the long build. I stopped waiting tables. I stopped doing data entry. I took every cent I had saved and invested it into a small, struggling water filtration startup that was on the verge of bankruptcy. I didn't just invest money. I brought them the Clarity Project. I brought them the data that Sterling had called primitive. For the next 7 years, I became a shadow in the boardroom. I worked under a pseudonym, Alara Vane, a bitter irony, using Marcus's last name, so that no one from my hometown would see me coming. I was the architect of the company's pivot. We didn't just sell filters, we sold the technology to municipal governments. We became the clarity the world needed. I watched our stock prices rise from the corner of a tiny office, then a larger office, and finally, from the top floor of a skyscraper that overlooked the entire bay. My mother moved out of that studio apartment and into a house with a garden that smelled of jasmine, far away from the scent of bleach and industrial steam. But I stayed in the city. I stayed close to the data. I began to quietly buy up debt. Not just any debt, specific, localized debt. I bought the distressed bonds of the Lincoln High School district. I bought the underfunded pension liabilities of the regional teachers' union. I bought the mortgages of the country club estates where Sterling spent his weekends. I was weaving a net, strand by strand, year by year. It was a slow burn process. Revenge, I realized, isn't a flash of lightning, it's a rising tide. It's quiet, it's inevitable. And by the time you feel the water at your ankles, it's already too late to swim. By my 35th birthday, I was no longer a ghost. I was the acquirer. I was the woman who turned failing systems into gold. I wore suits that cost more than Sterling's annual salary, and I spoke in a voice that made rooms go silent. I had everything I ever wanted. But the hunger in my stomach hadn't gone away. It wouldn't go away until I saw the red pen back in the hand that had used it so cruelly. I checked the news from my hometown once a week. I saw that the textile mill had finally closed, leaving the town's economy in a tailspin. I saw that the school district was facing a $10 million deficit, and I saw a small announcement in the local gazette, Arthur Sterling, interim superintendent, to seek private investment for district survival. I sat in my leather chair, the city lights twinkling like diamonds below me. I picked up the empty red pen from the velvet case on my desk and rolled it between my fingers. "It's time, Arthur," I whispered to the empty room. I made one phone call. Buy the Lincoln District Pension Fund, all of it, and set up an interview for the new consultancy position. Tell them I want to meet the candidates personally. But as I prepared for my return, I received an anonymous email. It contained a single photograph, a picture of my father, taken just last month, standing outside a small house in a neighboring state. He looked tired, but he was alive, and he was holding a letter with a very familiar seal. Sterling hadn't just run him out of town, he was still keeping him on a leash. The transformation from a ghost into an empress didn't happen in the light. It happened in the quiet, sterile hours between 2 in the morning and dawn, where the only sound was the hum of my computer and the scratch of my fountain pen. I had moved on from the empty red pen of my youth to a heavy silver-barreled instrument. It felt like a scepter. To the world, I was the enigmatic founder of Thorn Acquisitions. I was the woman who walked into failing industries and found the one gear that was jammed, the one person who was lying, and the one path to profit. People called me the surgeon because I cut away the dead weight with clinical precision. They had no idea that I had learned that terminology from Arthur Sterling. He had wanted to discard me. Now, I was the one deciding what was worth keeping. By 36, my empire was a labyrinth of holding companies and intellectual property, but the crown jewel was the Clarity Initiative. It was the evolved version of my high school science project. We had patented a molecular filtration system that could turn the gray, chemical-laden runoff of a textile mill into water pure enough for a laboratory. I sat in my office on the 54th floor, the walls made of reinforced glass that seemed to hold back the weight of the sky. The room was decorated in shades of slate and bone, calm, cold, and expensive. I didn't have photos of family on my desk. I didn't have trophies. I only had that small, velvet-lined case containing the empty red pen and the photo of my father that had arrived like a ghost in my inbox. The photo was a jagged wound in my carefully constructed reality. My father, Silas Thorne, looked like a shadow of the man I remembered. In the image, he was standing by a mailbox, his shoulders slumped, his hair a shock of white. He looked defeated, but the envelope in his hand, the one with the gold-embossed seal of the Lincoln School District, meant that Sterling was still pulling the strings. "He's using him," I whispered, my breath fogging the glass of the window. 20 years later, and he's still using him as a shield. I knew how Sterling's mind worked. He was a collector of leverage. He didn't just want people to fail, he wanted to own their failure. He had likely kept my father in a state of perpetual fear, promising to keep the embezzlement charges quiet as long as Silas stayed away and stayed silent. It was a masterpiece of psychological imprisonment. Thorne, my assistant, Marcus, no relation to the Marcus from my youth, though the name still tasted like copper in my mouth, stood in the doorway. He was young, efficient, and terrified of my silences. "The audit of the Lincoln District Pension Fund is complete," he said, stepping onto the plush carpet. "It's worse than we thought. Sterling and the previous board didn't just mismanage the funds, they used the pension assets as collateral for high-risk private equity loans to prop up the textile mill before it folded. Now that the mill is gone, the pension fund is a hollow shell. If word gets out, 300 retired teachers will lose everything." I turned my chair slowly. The city lights reflected in my eyes. "And Mr. Sterling, how is he handling the crisis?" "He's desperate," Marcus replied. "He's been trying to secure a bridge loan from private donors to cover the gap before the state audit next month. He's telling everyone it's a temporary liquidity issue. He has no idea we've already bought the debt he's trying to consolidate." I felt a surge of cold satisfaction. It was the feeling of a predator watching a target walk into a snare. Sterling was looking for a savior, a private investor with deep pockets and no questions. "He was looking for me. Set up the meeting," I said, "but not here. I don't want him to see the name Thorne on the building yet. We'll use the Vane Investment Group shell. Tell him the managing director is interested in a districts in distress, philanthropic partnership." "Should I prepare the contract?" "No," I said, looking back at the photo of my father. "Prepare a confession. And Marcus." "Yes, Miss Thorne. Find out exactly where that photo was taken. I want a team on the ground. If my father is being held by a threat of fear, I want to be the one to cut it." For the next week, I worked with a ferocity that concerned even my closest advisors. I wasn't just building an empire anymore, I was preparing for a siege. I studied Sterling's financial history like it was a holy text. I found the traces of his red pen everywhere, in the denied scholarships of poor students, in the bloated salaries of his cronies, and in the environmental compliance reports he had falsified for the mill. He had built his life on the idea that the elite were entitled to the labor and the lives of the failures. He thought he was the architect, and I was just the scrap metal. On the night before I was set to return to my hometown, I sat with my mother in her garden. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the sound of crickets. She looked at me, her eyes clouded with a worry she couldn't quite hide. "You're going back, aren't you?" she asked softly. I have to, Mom. For Dad, for us. He's a dangerous man, Elara. Not because he's strong, but because he's small. Small men burn everything down when they're scared. Let him burn, I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. I've spent 20 years learning how to walk through fire. As I drove toward the town limits the next morning, the gray drizzle of the city gave way to the familiar, oppressive dampness of the valley. The Welcome to Lincoln sign was rusted, the paint peeling away like dead skin. The town looked smaller, sadder, and more fragile than I remembered. I pulled up to the local hotel, the only one with 4 stars, and checked in under my pseudonym. As I unpacked my charcoal silk suit, I noticed a small envelope slipped under my door. There was no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper. It wasn't a letter, it was a photocopy of my high school transcript. Every grade was an I, except for one. At the very bottom, in fresh, bright red ink that looked like it hadn't even dried yet, was a giant, jagged F. Underneath it, in a handwriting I would know anywhere, were the words, "Some things never change, Elara. I'm looking forward to our meeting." My heart hammered once, then stilled. He knew. He had known the whole time. The trap I thought I was setting. He had been waiting for me to step into it. The Welcome to Lincoln sign was a relic of a ghost town. As I drove my obsidian black SUV past the rusted metal, I felt as though I were driving through a cemetery of my own memories. The town hadn't grown. It had merely withered. The shops on Main Street, that once boasted bright awnings, were now boarded up with plywood, their windows covered in layers of grime and old for rent signs. I checked into the Lincoln Crest Hotel. It was the grand establishment of the valley, but the carpet in the lobby smelled of damp cigarettes and cheap lavender air freshener. After finding the red F in my room, I didn't panic. I didn't pack my bags and flee. I sat on the edge of the bed, smoothed out the charcoal fabric of my trousers, and waited for my heartbeat to settle into its usual cold rhythm. He knew. The realization was a sharp needle, but I welcomed the sting. If Arthur Sterling knew I was coming, it meant he was playing his final hand. He was arrogant enough to think that the girl he broke 20 years ago was the same woman walking back into his office today. He thought he was the cat, and I was the mouse. He didn't realize that the mouse had spent 2 decades studying the mechanics of the trap. The next morning, the sky was a flat, unyielding white. I decided to walk to the school district office. I wanted to feel the pavement of my hometown beneath my heels. I wanted to see the cracks in the sidewalk I used to memorize while walking home with my head down. Everything looked smaller. The high school, which once felt like a sprawling fortress of doom, was just a tired 2-story brick building with peeling paint and overgrown weeds pushing through the asphalt of the tennis courts. I stood at the gates for a moment, the cold wind whipping my hair across my face. I remembered the girl who stood here in 2004. She was hungry, she was tired, and she was terrified. I closed my eyes and whispered to her, "Wait for it. The sun is about to go down on him." I entered the district office. The air inside was heavy with the scent of floor wax and stale coffee, the universal scent of failing bureaucracy. The receptionist, a woman whose nameplate read Brenda, looked up from her computer with a bored expression that quickly sharpened into curiosity as she took in my suit, my watch, and the way I held myself. "I'm here to see Mr. Fearden now acts Sterling," I said. "I believe I'm expected." "And you are." "The answer to his prayers," I said softly. She blinked, then buzzed him in. "Go on back, Miss Vane." Last door on the left. I walked down the hallway. On the walls were framed photos of distinguished alumni and legacy donors. I saw Marcus Vane's father. I saw the town's former mayor. I saw a younger, more vibrant Arthur Sterling standing in front of the textile mill, looking like a king. I reached the last door. It was heavy oak, but the polish had worn off around the handle. I didn't knock. I turned the knob and stepped inside. The office was a shrine to a disappearing world. Shelves were lined with leather-bound books that looked like they hadn't been opened in years. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and peppermint. And there, behind a desk that looked far too large for him now, sat Arthur Sterling. He was holding a red pen. He was clicking it. Click, 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 click. A rhythmic, taunting sound. "Elara," he said, not looking up. "You're late. I expected you at 9. It seems your professional rigor still needs work." I didn't answer immediately. I walked over to the guest chair, the one where parents usually sat to hear about their children's failures, and sat down. I crossed my legs, the silk of my suit whispering, I placed my designer handbag on the floor and looked him directly in the eyes. "The girl you're looking for isn't here, Arthur," I said. "And the woman who is, she doesn't take notes from the likes of you." He finally looked up. His eyes were watery, the blue faded to a dull gray, but the malice was still there, sharp and focused. He leaned forward, the light from the desk lamp catching the age spots on his forehead. "You've done well for yourself, I see. A shell company, a fake name, a fancy car, but you can't buy class, Alara. And you certainly can't buy back a reputation. I know about the Clarity Company. I know you've been buying the district's debt. Did you think I wouldn't notice a shark circling my waters?" "I'm not a shark, Arthur," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "I'm the tide, and your water is receding." He laughed, a dry, raspy sound that turned into a cough. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a file. "You think you're here to fire me? To humiliate me? You've forgotten one thing. I still have the red pen. And I still have your father." He slid a photograph across the desk. It was different from the one I had received. In this one, my father was sitting in a sterile-looking room looking confused. There was a nurse in the background. "Silas isn't just hiding, Alara," Sterling sneered. "He's in a private care facility. One that I fund. One that depends on the very pension fund you're trying to dismantle. If the district goes under, the facility closes. And your father? Well, a man with his mental fragility wouldn't last a week on the street. He doesn't even remember your name." The coldness I had felt for 20 years suddenly turned into a sharp, white-hot spike of rage. But I didn't let it show. I didn't flinch. I let the silence grow, thick and suffocating, until Sterling began to shift in his chair. "Is that your move?" I asked, holding a sick man hostage to protect a bankrupt legacy. "It's not hostage-taking, Alara. It's administration. Now, let's talk about that bridge loan. You're going to sign over the debt you purchased to a private trust I control. In exchange, I'll keep Silas comfortable. And I might even let you keep your fancy title." I leaned forward, my face inches from his. I could smell the decay on his breath. "You really haven't changed, Arthur," I said. "You still think people are just objects to be moved on a board. But you made a mistake. You forgot that I was the student who spent her nights fixing broken machines." I stood up and smoothed my blazer. "Keep the photo. You're going to need it to remember what power felt like. Our next meeting won't be in this office. It'll be in the boardroom of Thorn Acquisitions. And I suggest you bring a lawyer, a very good one." As I walked to the door, he called out, "You're failing again, Alara. You're choosing your pride over your father." I paused at the threshold, my hand on the cold brass handle. "No, Arthur, I'm choosing the truth. Tell me, did you ever wonder why the Vane Investment Group was so easy for you to track?" I didn't wait for his answer. I walked out, the sound of my heels echoing like a countdown. As I reached my car, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus, my assistant. "Location confirmed. The facility is a sham. It's a derelict wing of the Old Mill Hospital. We're moving in now." I looked back at the district office. Sterling was standing at the window, his silhouette small and dark against the light. He thought he had trapped me. He didn't realize I had just used him to lead me exactly where my father was being hidden. But as I pulled away, I saw a black sedan following me. It wasn't the police. It was a car I recognized from the country club, the same one that had sat outside my apartment 20 years ago. The grand reopening of the Lincoln Cultural Center was a desperate gasp for air by a dying social circle. The building, once an opera house, had been refurbished with the very funds Sterling had diverted from the teachers' pensions. It was a monument to vanity, draped in heavy velvet curtains that smelled of mothballs and hidden secrets. I arrived late. It was a calculated move, the Thorn entrance. The rain had intensified, turning the streets of my hometown into dark, shimmering ribbons. I stepped out of the SUV, my umbrella held by a silent driver. I wore a gown of midnight blue silk, the fabric so heavy and fine it rippled like water with every step. Around my neck was a single strand of black pearls, a gift to myself for every year I had survived the long silence. As I entered the ballroom, the sound of a mediocre string quartet filled the air. The room was a sea of familiar faces, aged and weathered like old leather left in the sun. There was Marcus Vane, now a bloated version of his father, clutching a glass of expensive scotch. There was the former mayor, his laugh too loud, his eyes too darting. And there, in the center of the room, was Arthur Sterling. He was wearing a tuxedo that had fit him better 10 years ago. He was holding court, his voice booming as he talked about the rebirth of the district, He looked like a man who believed his own lies. When he saw me, his smile didn't falter, but his grip on his champagne flute tightened until his knuckles went white. I didn't head for the bar. I didn't mingle. I walked straight to the center of the floor, the crowd parting around me like I was a shark in a koi pond. "Ms. Vane," Sterling said, his voice carrying across the room. He used my pseudonym with a sneer. "I didn't think you'd have the courage to show your face after our little chat this morning. I assume you've brought the transfer papers for the bridge loan." The music seemed to falter. The guests turned, their curiosities piqued by the tension radiating between us. "I have brought something better than papers, Arthur," I said. My voice was calm, a cool breeze in the stifling heat of the ballroom. "I've brought the truth. But first, let's have a toast. To legacies." I took a glass from a passing waiter. I didn't drink. I just held it, the bubbles rising and popping like tiny dying stars. "You all know Mr. Sterling." I addressed the room, my gaze sweeping over the elite of Lincoln. The man who saved the school district, the man who protects your interests. But how many of you know about the red pen accounts? The ones that funded this very chandelier while the elementary school roof leaked for 6 years. A murmur of unease rippled through the crowd. Sterling's face turned a mottled purple. "That is enough. You are a guest here. I am not a guest," I interrupted, my voice sharpening just enough to cut through his bluster. "I am the majority shareholder of the Lincoln Municipal Debt. I own the note on this building. I own the pension fund. And as of 20 minutes ago, I own the property at 402 Industrial Way, the old mill hospital." The color drained from Sterling's face so fast I thought he might collapse. The glass in his hand trembled. You have no right." "I have every right, because unlike you, Arthur, I don't use people as collateral." I stepped closer, my heels clicking on the marble floor. "While you were here drinking champagne and celebrating a rare birth built on stolen futures, my team was at that hospital. They found Silas Thorne." At the mention of the name, several of the older guests gasped. The ghost of the man they had helped Sterling exile had finally returned to haunt them. "He's safe now," I continued, my voice dropping to that low, dangerous hum. "He's in a real hospital, with real doctors, and he started to talk. He's talking about the textile mill, he's talking about the chemical dumping, and he's talking about the man who threatened to put his wife and daughter on the street if he didn't take the fall for the board's embezzlement." The room was deathly silent now. The string quartet had stopped playing entirely. "You're insane," Sterling hissed, his voice cracking. "No one will believe a word from a man with dementia. You're a failure, Alara. You were a failure in 2004, and you're a failure now. You're just a girl in a borrowed dress playing at being a queen." I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the fear behind his eyes, the desperation of a man who realized the ground was no longer beneath his feet. I felt a wave of pity, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. "I'm not playing, Arthur," I said. I reached into my small clutch bag and pulled out a single red felt-tip pen. I held it up so the entire room could see it. "This was your weapon. You used it to mark lives as failures. You used it to erase potential. You used it to sign away the dignity of a good man." I walked to the decorative guest book sitting on a mahogany plinth near the door. With a slow, deliberate motion, I drew a massive, jagged F across the page. The same F he had given me 20 years ago. "The grade is in, Arthur, and you failed." I turned to the room, my expression unreadable. "The gala is over. The locks on this building will be changed at midnight. If you have personal items in your offices, I suggest you retrieve them now. Except for you, Mr. Sterling. You're staying right here. The state auditors and the regional police are waiting in the foyer." I didn't wait for the chaos to erupt. I didn't stay to watch him be led away. I walked out of the ballroom, the midnight blue silk of my dress trailing behind me like a shadow. But as I reached the heavy oak doors, Marcus Vane stepped in my path. He didn't look angry. He looked terrified. "Alara, wait," he whispered. "You don't understand. It wasn't just Sterling, my father, the whole board. If you do this, you destroy the whole town." I looked at Marcus, the boy who once had the gold star future. "The town was destroyed a long time ago, Marcus. I'm just the one clearing the rubble." I stepped past him and into the rain. My driver opened the door and I sank into the leather seat. I felt exhausted, a deep, bone-weary fatigue that I had been running from for half my life. I closed my eyes, expecting to feel a surge of triumph. Instead, my phone buzzed. It was a call from the hospital, where my father had been taken. "Ms. Thorne, you need to come quickly. Your father is awake. He's asking for someone named Arthur. He says there's one more folder, something Sterling never showed anyone." The hospital wing was silent, a stark contrast to the crumbling opulence of the gala. Here, the air was sharp with the scent of antiseptic and the rhythmic artificial breathing of machines. I walked down the corridor, the silk of my gown rustling, a sound that felt entirely too loud in a place where people spoke in whispers. My father looked small in the hospital bed, his skin nearly as white as the linens. But his eyes were open. When I stepped into the light, he didn't see the CEO of Thorne Acquisitions. He saw a girl in a graduation gown. "Elora," he croaked, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "The folder in the mill chimney." The hollow brick. Arthur, he didn't just dump the chemicals. He was selling the clean water rights to a third party while the town drank the runoff. I felt the floor tilt. It wasn't just greed, it was a deliberate poisoning of a population for a secondary profit. Sterling hadn't just been a bad teacher. He had been a merchant of death. I left the hospital at 3 a.m. While the rest of the town slept, I activated the financial collapse protocol. The next morning, the sun didn't rise. It merely leaked through a thick yellow fog. By 9 a.m., the news had hit the regional wires. Thorne Acquisitions was pulling all support from the Lincoln School District. Because of the discovery of systemic fraud and environmental liabilities, the credit rating of the entire town was slashed to junk status overnight. The panic was quiet at first. It started with the banks. By noon, the local branch of the Valley Trust had locked its doors. People stood in the drizzling rain, tapping on the glass with their wedding rings, their faces pale reflections of my own mother's face 20 years ago. The E-Light were the first to feel the burn. The country club's accounts were frozen. The Vane family's assets were tied up in a federal investigation. I sat in my makeshift office in the hotel suite, watching the numbers on my laptop screen tumble like a waterfall. It was a bloodless massacre. I wasn't just taking Sterling's job, I was evaporating the very ground he stood on. Without the pension fund to manipulate, and with the red pen accounts exposed, he was a man standing in a desert with no water. A knock came at the door. It wasn't the police. It was the school board, or what was left of it. 3 men and 2 women, looking like they had aged a decade in 4 hours. "Miss Thorne," the spokesperson said, his voice trembling, "the teachers haven't been paid. The buses have no fuel for tomorrow. We didn't know the extent of Arthur's adjustments. We need the bridge loan, please. For the children." I looked at them from behind my desk. I didn't feel the rush of power I expected. I felt a cold, heavy responsibility. "The children are the reason I'm doing this," I said. "The bridge loan is dead. I'm not lending money to a corpse. However, I am prepared to buy the district's infrastructure entirely. Every brick, every bus, every desk. I will privatize the administration, settle the pensions out of my own pocket, and purge every single person who signed off on Sterling's audits." "You want to own the school?" the woman asked, horrified. "I want to fix it," I replied. "But there is a condition. Arthur Sterling is to be stripped of his emeritus status. His pension is to be forfeited to the Environmental Cleanup Fund, and he is to be served with his termination papers today, in person, by me." They looked at each other. They had no choice. The Great Protector had become a liability. They signed the emergency resolution right there on the hotel stationery. As they left, I looked at the folder my team had retrieved from the old mill chimney. It contained the original filtration logs, the ones that proved my father had been right all along, but tucked in the back was something else. A letter, written by Sterling to a private equity firm 20 years ago. "The Thorne girl is a nuisance," it read. "But she has her father's spark. I will dampen it until it goes out. A failure is easier to manage than a witness. He hadn't hated me because I was poor. He had hated me because I was the only person in that town with the potential to see through him. The F wasn't a grade. It was a muzzle." I stood up and put on my coat. The final interview was about to begin. Sterling was waiting in the district office, unaware that he was no longer the one asking the questions. But as I reached the elevator, I saw a news report on the lobby TV. A fire had broken out at the old textile mill. The site of the evidence. Sterling wasn't going down without a fight. He was trying to burn the past before I could use it to bury his future. The smoke from the old textile mill hung over the town like a funeral shroud, a thick, acrid haze that tasted of sulfur and scorched chemicals. It was the smell of a man trying to erase his sins with a matchbook. I stood by the window of the district office, watching the distant orange glow against the gray sky. Sterling thought he had destroyed the evidence. He didn't realize that in the digital age, a folder is just a physical ghost. The data had been scanned and encrypted into my cloud servers the moment my team touched it. I turned back to the room. This was the same office where I had been told I wouldn't graduate. The same room where I had been called a void. Now the nameplate on the desk had been removed, leaving a rectangular scar on the wood. A soft knock came at the door. "Enter," I said. My voice was like a calm lake, flat, cold, and deep. Arthur Sterling stepped inside. He wasn't the man from the gala. He wasn't the king of the school. He looked like a man who had been caught in a landslide. His tuxedo was gone, replaced by a rumpled corduroy jacket that smelled of old tobacco and wood smoke. His hair was disheveled, and there was a smudge of soot on his cheek. He didn't see me at first. He saw the consultant position advertisement I had placed in the local paper, a bait so specific it was impossible for a desperate man to ignore. He thought he was walking into an interview with a representative from an out-of-town firm that could save his reputation. "I'm here for the job." "For the consultancy interview," he said, his voice cracking. He adjusted his glasses, squinting in the dim light. "I was told a Miss Thorne would be conducting the—" He stopped. His breath hitched in his throat as I stepped out of the shadows. "Sit down, Arthur," I said, gesturing to the chair. The same chair I had occupied as a terrified teenager. He didn't sit. He gripped the back of the chair until his knuckles turned a ghostly white. You set this up. The Vane Investment Group, the debt, it was all a game to you. A game." I repeated the word slowly, savoring the weight of it. "No, Arthur. A game implies a chance of winning. This was an audit. And your books have been found wanting." I sat behind the desk. His desk. I pulled a single sheet of paper from a folder. It was his formal application for the consultancy role. He had listed his achievements: 30 years of discipline, a legacy of excellence, and a proven track record of identifying student potential. "I've reviewed your resume," I said, tapping the paper with the end of the silver pen. "It's a work of fiction. You mention identifying potential, yet you spent 20 years trying to suppress it. You talk about discipline, but you used it as a cloak for extortion." I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto his. "You're not here for an interview, Arthur. You're here for an exit. But because I believe in the honesty you so often preached, I'm going to give you a choice." I placed 2 envelopes on the desk. One was white. One was red. In the white envelope is a graceful retirement. You sign a full confession regarding the textile mill and the pension fund. You relinquish all claims to any board positions. In return, I don't press charges. You get to fade away into the obscurity you so feared for me. Sterling's eyes flickered to the red envelope. "And the other one?" "The red one," I said, a ghost of a smile touching my lips, "is the truth. It contains the evidence of the chemical dumping, the proof that you poisoned this town's water for a kickback from a private equity firm. If you choose this," I hand it to the federal agents waiting in the hallway, "you won't fade away, Arthur. You'll be the most famous man in the state, for all the wrong reasons." He looked at the envelopes, his chest heaving. The administrative liaison was gone. In his place was a small, frightened man who realized that his red pen had finally run out of ink. "Why?" he whispered. "Why go to all this trouble? You're a billionaire. You have everything. Why come back to this pathetic town to ruin an old man?" "Because you didn't just grade me, Arthur," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a blade. "You tried to define me. You told a hungry, tired girl that she was nothing. You used your power to make sure my mother suffered. You tried to erase my father from history. I didn't come back to ruin an old man. I came back to correct the record." He reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered over the white envelope. "I did what I had to do for the school, to keep it funded, to keep the right people happy." "The right people," I scoffed. "You mean the ones who could afford to look the other way while children in the North End developed rashes from the tap water? The ones who cheered when you weeded out the kids from the apartments?" I stood up, pushing the chair back with a sharp screech against the floor. "The interview is over, Arthur. But before you decide, I want you to look at this." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old yellowed detention slip from 2004, the one I had placed face down in our very first meeting in the boardroom. I flipped it over. On the back, in my own youthful, messy handwriting, were 3 words: "I am coming." He stared at the paper, the realization dawning on him that I had been planning this since the moment I walked out of his classroom. I hadn't just gotten lucky. I had built an entire life as a siege engine aimed directly at his front door. I need time to think, he stammered, backing toward the door. You have until the mill fire is extinguished, I said, looking at my watch. The fire department says that should be in about 20 minutes. After that, the red envelope is the only one left on the table. He turned and practically ran from the room. I stood there, listening to his retreating footsteps, the sound echoing through the empty halls of the district office. I picked up the red pen he had dropped on the desk. I held it for a moment, then dropped it into the trash can. But as I prepared to leave, my phone buzzed. It was a call from the team at the mill. Miss Thorne, we found something in the rubble. It wasn't just files. There's a secondary basement. And Laura, there are barrels down here with the school district's seal on them. It's worse than we thought. He wasn't just dumping, he was storing. The discovery at the mill changed the texture of my revenge. It was no longer just about a girl and her teacher. It was about a crime against a community. The secondary basement of the mill, hidden beneath a false concrete floor, contained 52 industrial barrels. They were marked with the Lincoln School District's seal, a cruel irony, as the seal featured an open book and a torch of knowledge. I stood in the humid darkness of my hotel suite, the only light coming from the glowing grid of the city on my laptop. I felt a weight in my chest that had nothing to do with the F on my paper. It was the weight of 1,000 lives affected by a man's arrogance. I began to write my final internal monologue, not for a board meeting, but for myself. I thought about the better person the self-help books told me to be. They said that living well is the best revenge. But living well felt hollow when the man who had tried to bury you was still breathing the air he had poisoned for others. The struggle was internal and silent. Part of me, the part that still wore hand-me-down shoes, wanted to see Arthur Sterling in a jumpsuit, his hands cuffed, his dignity stripped away in a brightly lit courtroom. But the CEO in me, the woman who had built Thorne Acquisitions, knew that a public trial would tie the school district in knots for a decade. It would drain the very funds I had just replenished. I looked at the silver pen on my desk. Am I becoming him? I wondered. Am I moving people like pieces on a board to suit my own sense of justice? I realized then that the difference between me and Arthur Sterling wasn't the power we held. It was the purpose behind it. He used his red pen to erase. I was using mine to rewrite. I spent the rest of the night coordinating with the environmental cleanup crews. We would bypass the red tape. I would fund the removal of the barrels personally under the guise of a voluntary corporate social responsibility project. It would keep the town's name out of the toxic headlines while ensuring the water was finally truly safe. But I wouldn't let Sterling walk away. At 4 a.m. my mother called. She couldn't sleep. The news of the mill fire had reached her, and she knew I was at the center of the storm. Alara, she said, her voice soft and heavy with the wisdom of someone who had survived the basement. You've won. You've brought your father home. You've saved the school. Don't let the weight of his sins become your anchor. I'm not holding an anchor, Mom, I replied, looking at the red envelope sitting on my desk. I'm holding a mirror. I just want him to see what he really is before the light goes out. I thought about the silent power move I had planned for the final confrontation. It wasn't going to be a shout. It wasn't going to be a scene. It was going to be a signature. As the sun began to rise over the valley, casting a sickly orange glow through the lingering smoke, I received a final email from my legal team. Arthur Sterling had signed the confession. He had chosen the white envelope. He had chosen to disappear. But there was a clause he had overlooked in the fine print. A clause I had inserted myself. It was a clarity clause. It stated that while I wouldn't press criminal charges, the confession would be placed in the permanent archives of Lincoln High, accessible to any student who wished to read the true history of the district. His legacy wouldn't be erased. It would be exposed. I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet stillness that I hadn't felt in 20 years. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a foundation. I prepared my final outfit for the firing. Not a silk gown. Not a designer suit. I went to the local thrift store and bought a simple oversized gray sweater and a pair of worn-in jeans. I wanted to look like the girl he had tried to break. I wanted him to see that the ghost had come back to claim the house. As I walked toward the district office for the final time, the town felt different. The air was clearer. The welcome to Lincoln sign had been taken down by a maintenance crew. My crew. We were going to put up a new one that didn't just welcome people to a town, but to a future. But as I entered the building, I saw a line of teachers standing in the hallway. They weren't there to protest. They were there to watch. They had heard the rumors. They had seen the audits. And in the middle of the line stood Marcus Vane. He looked at me, and for the first time he didn't look down. He nodded. I reached Sterling's office. The door was open. He was sitting in the middle of the room, surrounded by cardboard boxes. He was packing his excellence. I walked in, the soles of my sneakers, silent on the carpet. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, waiting. He looked up, and for a moment he didn't see the billionaire. He saw the girl from booth 42. His lip trembled. "I signed it," he said, his voice a pathetic whimper. "Now leave me alone." I didn't leave. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old graded paper, the one with the red F that had started it all. I placed it on the top of his box. "You missed a spot, Arthur," I said. The silence in the office was absolute. It wasn't the respectful silence of a library or the focused silence of a laboratory. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a vacuum. Arthur Sterling looked down at the old yellowed paper I had placed atop his box of belongings. The red fees seemed to pulse against the dim light of the office, a scar that had finally reopened. He didn't touch it. He stared at it as if it were an unexploded bomb. 20 years, he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You kept a failing grade for 20 years just to do this. You're more disturbed than I thought, Elara." "I didn't keep it to remind me of the grade, Arthur," I said. I pulled out a chair, not the guest chair, but the one behind the desk, and sat down. I leaned back, my movements slow and deliberate. "I kept it to remind me of the sound of your voice when you gave it to me. I kept it to remember the smell of the rain that day, and the way my mother cried when she thought we were going to be homeless because of your phone calls." I picked up the silver pen from the desk, the one I had used to sign the documents that now owned his life, and turned it over in my fingers. "You're not being fired because of this paper," I continued, my voice steady and calm. "You're being fired because you are an institutional failure. You were trusted with the most valuable resource this town had, its children, and you treated them like inventory to be discarded. You weren't a teacher, you were a warden." Sterling stood up, his legs shaking. He tried to summon a final spark of his old authority. "I built this district. I made sure the right families stayed here. I protected the standards of Lincoln High." "The standards?" I laughed softly, a sound without mirth. "You protected a facade. You ignored the leaks in the roof and the chemicals in the water because the right families didn't want their property taxes to go up. You traded the health and futures of a generation for a seat at the country club." I opened the red folder I had brought with me. Inside was the termination notice, signed by the emergency board. It wasn't a standard HR form, it was a comprehensive list of his violations, from the pension fraud to the environmental cover-up. "As of this moment," I said, sliding the document across the desk, "your employment with the Lincoln School District is terminated for cause. Effective immediately. You are barred from all school properties. Your name will be removed from the library wing by noon tomorrow. And your pension? It's been redirected. Every cent will go toward the medical bills of the families who live near the mill." Sterling reached for the paper, his hand trembling so violently, he nearly knocked over his box of trophies. He read the words, his eyes darting back and forth. "You can't do this," he hissed. "The confession, you said no charges if I signed the white envelope." I said I wouldn't press charges. I corrected him gently, but I never said anything about the teachers' union or the families of the North End. "Once your confession hits the archives, Arthur, I suspect the civil lawsuits will keep you busy for the rest of your life. You'll spend your retirement in depositions, explaining to mothers why their children have chronic lung issues." The air seemed to leave him. He sank back into his chair, looking every bit of his 70 years. He looked small. He looked fragile. He looked like the nothing he had once accused me of being. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I have nowhere to go, no one left." I stood up and walked to the window. The mill fire was out now, leaving only a skeletal black frame against the sky. The town was waking up. I could see a yellow school bus turning the corner, its lights flashing. "You're going to do exactly what you told me to do in 2004, I said, not turning around. "You're going to be realistic. You're going to realize that the world doesn't care about your struggle. It only cares about results. And these are your results, Arthur. A hollow town, a poisoned well, and a legacy written in disappearing ink." I turned back to him. I didn't feel the surge of joy I had imagined for 2 decades. I didn't feel the need to gloat. I felt only a profound sense of closure. The circle was finished. The debt was paid. Pack your things, Arthur. Security will escort you to the gate. Don't take the red pen. It belongs to the district now. I walked out of the office. As I passed through the outer sanctum, the teachers who had been waiting in the hallway stood in silence. They didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They simply watched as the man who had ruled them with fear was led out by two silent men in black suits. Marcus Vane was standing near the exit. He looked at me, his face pale. What happens to the rest of us, Alara? The ones who just followed orders? That depends, I said, stopping for a moment. Do you still believe some kids are born to fail? Marcus looked down at his shoes. Expensive polished leather. Then he looked at the scuffed sneakers I was wearing. No, he whispered. I don't think I do. Then you have a lot of work to do, I said. Start by cleaning the gym. The science fair is in 2 months. And this year, the prize won't be a plastic trophy. It'll be a scholarship to a university of their choice, funded by Thorn Acquisitions. I walked out of the building and into the crisp morning air. My mother was waiting in the car. She didn't ask how it went. She just reached over and took my hand. Is it over? She asked. No, I said, looking up at the school. It's just beginning, but first, there's one last lesson I need to attend. But as we pulled away from the curb, I saw a figure standing by the old school gate. It was a man I hadn't seen in 20 years, holding a tattered history book and a small brass compass that finally, for the first time in my life, was pointing due north. The gravel of the school parking lot crunched under my sneakers, a sound that, for the first time in 20 years, didn't feel like a countdown to an ending, but the beginning of a rhythm. I walked toward the man standing by the gate. My father, Silas Thorne, looked fragile in the morning light, but his eyes were clear. The confusion that had clouded them in the mill hospital had lifted, replaced by a weary, quiet pride. He held out the brass compass. It was a cheap thing, really pitted with age and salt, but the needle was steady. It was no longer spinning in the frantic circles of my childhood. You found the way, Alara, he said, his voice a low vibration that felt like home. I spent 20 years thinking I had left you in the dark. I didn't know you had turned that darkness into a lighthouse. I had a good teacher, I said, a faint smile touching my lips. He taught me exactly who I didn't want to be. We stood there for a long moment, watching the town wake up. The gray mist was finally lifting, revealing the jagged peaks of the valley. It wasn't a beautiful town, and it wasn't a rich one, but it was breathing again. The long silence was over, replaced by the mundane, wonderful sounds of life. A dog barking, a distant siren, the hum of a town that no longer had a secret buried in its throat. I didn't stay to watch the workers remove Sterling's name from the library. I didn't stay to see the local news vans arrive. I had done what I came to do. I had corrected the record. I had shown the man with the red pen that you cannot grade a soul. 2 weeks later, I sat in my office on the 54th floor back in the city. The mahogany table was gone, replaced by a desk of reclaimed wood from the old textile mills, sanded, polished, and made new. The room didn't smell like filtered oxygen and beeswax anymore. It smelled of the jasmine tea my mother liked and the faint, earthy scent of the blueprints spread out before me. I wasn't looking at acquisition reports or debt ledgers. I was looking at the plans for the Silas Thorne Environmental Center. We were going to build it on the site of the old mill. It wouldn't be a place of secrets and shadows. It would be a place of science, filtration, and truth. My assistant, Marcus, entered the room. He walked differently now, with less fear and more purpose. The final audit is in, Miss Thorne, he said, placing a folder on my desk. The Lincoln district is officially stabilized. The teachers' pensions are secured in a trust they control, and the first round of scholarship applications for the Clarity Grant has arrived. He hesitated, then pulled a small battered envelope from his pocket. This arrived for you, it's from him. I took the envelope. It was addressed in a shaky, cramped handwriting. There was no return address, only a postmark from a small town 3 states away. I opened it. Inside was no letter, no apology, no plea for mercy. There was only a single blank piece of school paper, and in the center of it, written in blue ink, not red, was a single word, a plus. I looked at the paper for a long time. I realized that even now, even in his defeat and exile, Arthur Sterling was still trying to grade me. He still thought he held the power to validate my existence. He thought that by finally giving me the mark I had earned 20 years ago, he could find some shred of redemption or control. I felt a wave of laughter bubble up in my chest, not a bitter laugh, but a light, freeing one. I crumpled the paper into a small ball and tossed it into the recycling bin without a second thought. Anything else, Marcus? I asked, looking back at the blueprints. Just one thing. A student from Lincoln High called. She's 15. She says she has an idea for a solar-powered desalinization unit, but her teacher says it's unrealistic because of her grades in math. She wanted to know if the woman in the charcoal suit was still taking interviews. I felt a familiar spark in my chest. The same one that had kept me awake in that drafty apartment in 2004. Tell her I'll be there on Tuesday, I said, and tell her to bring her math test. I have a pen I'd like her to use to correct it. As Marcus left, I picked up the silver pen on my desk. I thought about the final lesson. People think that revenge is about making someone suffer. They think it's about a boardroom, a firing, or a public fall. But as I looked out at the city, I realized that true revenge isn't about the person who hurt you. It's about the person you became, despite them. Arthur Sterling was a ghost in a doorway now, a man living out the very prophecy he had tried to write for me. And I was the architect of a world that no longer had a place for men like him. I leaned back in my chair, the sunlight warming my face. The calm drama of my life had reached its finale, and for the first time the silence wasn't heavy. It was perfectly, beautifully still. Thank you for following my journey from the back row of a classroom to the top of the world. Before I close this chapter of my life, I want to leave you with one thought. What is the one thing someone told you you'd never achieve? Tell me, in the comments. I'd love to hear how you proved them wrong.